All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Kievit, and I am the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. I want to welcome you to our virtual series, History in Focus. History in Focus explores relevant topics in Upper Manhattan and the surrounding areas. We would like to thank the Honorable Carmen De La Rosa, New York City Council District 10, for her support of this program. During this lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer those questions at the end. This afternoon, we are joined by Dr. Philip Kasinitz, who is the Presidential Professor of Sociology and Director of the Advanced Research Collaborative at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where he founded the master's program in International Migration Studies. For this final presentation of History in Focus, Dr. Philip Kasinitz will explore some of the history of how New York has received immigrants and discuss what is and how it is relevant to today. Dr. Kasinitz will also present the surprising findings of a new study on attitudes towards migrants among today's New Yorkers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Philip Kasinitz.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I must, I'm afraid, start with a couple of apologies. I'm actually doing this lecture from my semi-office storeroom in Brooklyn in my house. That's because due to some emergency window repair, I had to be home today. I normally would do this from my office at CUNY. In addition, because of the emergency window repair, I'm locked up with two cats in this room. They may, at some point or another, decide to try to participate in the lecture, as they often do. This frequently happened back during COVID when I was teaching online. So hopefully we'll have to see how that goes. But in any event, I wanted to take this opportunity, and I'm really, really glad to be able to talk to people in Upper Manhattan, and particularly associated with the Dyckman Farmhouse, because of the historical importance of migration and the various traditions that have shaped New York, and how they've come to be important at this particular moment. And I suppose my main theme here is a perception in the last several years of migration having become, in some ways, a crisis in New York. We have a lot of discussion, particularly when the buses were arriving from Point South and people were being sent to New York by a lot of southern states, of the idea that somehow the city was in a crisis mode because of the extraordinary demands that were placed upon it. And frequently, and I guess I got interested in this topic in part because of the notion that was you frequently heard that this crisis was unprecedented, was the word that was often used, that this was something that was unique. Looking back over the history of migration in New York, I would make the argument that this crisis is far from unique, and it may not be a crisis, though it does, in fact, pose a number of problems. And there is a distinction to be made by an existential crisis versus something that requires problems that require management. I also think that a larger issue that we currently are really very much in the middle of, and I'm thinking kind of the headlines of the last couple of days, of a real conflict in attitudes about migration that between New York and the federal government. And this is also an old story, the one that comes back in force at some points and not in others. New York is seen generally in the United States as being more immigrant influenced and in many ways more open and more tolerant of immigration than other parts of the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about how and why that reputation was created, whether that reputation is totally deserved or not. I think it does shape perceptions both of New Yorkers' understandings of themselves, but also, frankly, of the way in which the rest of the country's attitudes towards New York are shaped. That New York has had an unusually pro-migrant attitude. Um, and again, this is something that comes and goes over time. But I think that it's certainly right at the moment, you kind of see a real shift in attitudes, that anti-immigrant sentiment sometimes turns into anti-New York sentiment. So all of these things are situations that frankly have to be viewed, I think, a little bit more in historical context. And since I am speaking to the people at the Dyckman Farmhouse, I suppose the first step is to take it back to the very beginnings of New Yorker self-concept, and that means starting with the Dutch, appropriately enough. So can I have the first slide, please? Okay. I think one of the things that makes New York distinct, particularly in its attitudes towards diversity and its attitudes towards migration as a creator of diversity, is its attitude towards its own history and its own founding. Since, well, New York is, when we think of American history and early settlement, we often think about things we're taught in school, the Pilgrims arriving in New England, the people arriving in Jamestown, the founding of Philadelphia by Penn. This all becomes, kind of notions of what America was supposed to be and kind of shaping the way American attitudes are going to be. The Dutch who founded New York, and we sometimes forget, New York is older than Boston, older than Philadelphia, almost as old as Jamestown, the settlements in Virginia. But the Dutch were different. And they were different. One way in which they were different was that they saw colonization as a commercial enterprise. They crossed the Atlantic to make money. And this left a sort of strange mixture. On the one hand, New York has always been the home of great extreme inequalities of wealth and power, perhaps more so than other places in the United States. So it's hardly an egalitarian society. In fact, in the 17th and 18th century, New York was the largest center of slavery outside of the South. At the same time, however, paradoxically, it also meant that a certain amount of cosmopolitanism and tolerance were there, in part because the enterprise was not founded on the idea of a common worldview in the way some of the more religiously inspired enterprises were. It was really founded on how do we make money. And that meant toleration of a lot of different kinds of people and interaction with a lot of different kinds of people, provided that it was profitable to local elites. And I think that that has left us with the idea that diversity and migration in particular are often popular among elites in New York in a way that they aren't in other places. And maybe I can have the next slide, please. This is probably initially most evident in what gets called the Flushing Remonstrance, which is Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New York in the 1650s, was very upset that Jews were settling in the city, the then village, actually. Portuguese Jews started to settle here from Brazil in the early 1650s. A staunch Calvinist, he wanted to ban this, but he was told by his bosses back in Amsterdam, his corporate officials said that he had no business banning people with whom they could make money. And then in 1657, he tries again with the idea that he is scandalized by the presence of Quakers in what was then the small farming village of Flushing in what's now Queens. And again, he asked permission to bar these heretics from his colony, and he got back this famous remonstrance, as it's called, which in which the corporate officials from the Dutch West Indies Company um, informed him that immigration must be favored. You must therefore close your eyes, or at least not force people's consciences, but allow everyone to have his own beliefs, so long as he behaves quietly and legally and gives no offense to his neighbors and does not oppose the government. And this sort of is the theme that survives both in Dutch New York, but more particularly after New York becomes a British colony and then after independence. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, in the 19th century, New York grows massively. I'm skipping ahead a long way. The 18th century is a little stagnant in New York due to British occupation, big fires, etc. The 19th century, there's an enormous population growth. Literally on 100 years, it grows 40-fold. But it's almost entirely due to migration. In fact, Ira Rosenwake, the demographer who wrote the definitive, if not exactly exciting, demographic history of New York City, notes that the net contribution of the American hinterland on balance was nil, which is to say that while certainly loads of people from other parts of the country came to New York, as opposed to a lot of the Midwestern cities or Chicago, their numbers were more than matched by the numbers of New Yorkers who left. And I'm sure we all know both people from other parts of the country who have come to the city, but also lots of people who grow up in New York who leave for the rest of the country. Population growth comes almost entirely through international migration. And in the 19th century, that's mostly in Europe, from Europe. In addition, the fact that immigrants, and this becomes particularly important in recent years, have higher fertility rates and are having more kids than the native population. So immigration plus the children that recent immigrants have are really the reason that the population is growing. And generally speaking, this is popular. I mean, for the most part, in most periods of time, people are either neutral or tolerant of this. By many of the elites of the city are actually in favor of it. They often see international migration as tied to international trade, which is extremely important in the city, as well as industrialization. But there are mixed periods, a number of them throughout the city's history, in which migration gets defined as a crisis, very much the way it's being defined to some degree in the last couple of years. And I think these crises generally happen when you have a very sudden influx of people who can be defined as very exotic or exceptional or not like the population that's already here. So can I have the next slide, please? And one of the first full-blown migration crises is what happens in the 1840s and 1850s. And like the current situation, it is sparked in part by events that occur well beyond New York's borders, but that create a really rapid influx of new migrants to New York. Probably the most significant, as many people know, is the Irish potato famine. Between 1845 and 1850, there's a massive famine all throughout Northern Europe, but particularly in Ireland, which swells the Irish population of the city enormously. Because the people who are arriving, the potato famine refugees, are effectively, well, they're poor. They're quite conceived of as quite culturally different. We don't often think of Irish immigration as posing a real racial difference issue today, but people then did, particularly the fact that it was a largely Catholic population. They're often particular, well, there were crime problems, there were drug problems, And the people involved were particularly unhappy about the circumstances that had forced them to leave their homeland. It's interesting, the number of Irish immigrants that arrived in the second half of the 1840s um, was almost exactly the same as the number that's arrived in the last 3 years, except, of course, the city was much, much smaller. 36% of the city's 371,000 people in 1845 were foreign born. By 1860, that had grown, the city's population had grown to a little over 800,000, which you think about it, in 15 years, that's pretty massive growth. And almost half were born abroad. And of course, that doesn't account their US born children. And the city of Brooklyn, which was still a separate city, had a similar growth. In which almost 40% of the nearly 270,000 people there were coming from abroad. And the largest group, again, were the Irish. Second largest group were the Germans. And the Germans were also seen as a problem. The crisis there was not poverty as much. Most of the Germans who came were coming with some resources. But it was really about ethnicity. More than almost any other group of previous migrants, the Germans were particularly interested in holding on to aspects of their culture. German language survived in New York, which is so long ago that we sometimes forget it, but people speaking German on the streets of New York was common right up until the First World War. There were German-speaking schools. There was, of course, the Lutheran Church. There were also German-speaking Catholic churches. There were also a lot of cultural societies, musical societies, mutual health societies, hospitals, all functioning in German throughout the 19th century. And that was considered, as sometimes we hear today, well, do these people want to assimilate or not? And the Germans were considered really much more problematic about assimilation, in part because of a real investment in the maintenance of their own culture. And what's, I think, particularly interesting is not only how long that continued, but how quickly that dissipated when the United States entered World War I. And suddenly, Frankfurters are redefined as hot dogs. I guess they continue to call hamburgers, but we sort of changed the accent on that and make that a little less essential. And many, many German organizations suddenly are switching into doing things in English. I guess the other issue that is sort of resonant with the present moment, crime. Particularly, not so much the Germans again as the Irish, but particularly the notion that there was a sudden upshot of criminal activity. And I think when we think about that as crime, I'm sure some of us have seen the movie Gangs of New York, which is completely historically inaccurate, with the exception of the hats, which are in fact quite accurate. But crime, in this case, very often when people talk about criminal activity, they mean disorder. Can I have the next slide? Okay. They mean the notion that people are streaming in without control, that the numbers have grown massively, that the city has, in fact, expanded beyond its boundaries. This is a quote, actually, from Cecil Woodham Smith's History of the Potato Famine, which is mostly about the situations between Ireland and Great Britain, but does a really interesting job of discussing the impact of the famine migration had on various cities in the United States. And one of the things that Woodham Smith mentions is the fact that New York had virtually no infrastructure for coping with this influx of new and very poor people. Up until a few years before the potato famine, there wasn't even a regular police force. There was a constabulary, which involved the Citizen Volunteer Watch into the 1830s. There was one building inspector in the entire city, which was not that big a problem because there were almost no building regulations. Many people were living in basements. Sewage was underdeveloped. The water supply was underdeveloped. So it was a city that was really not set up for taking that level of immigration all at once. Next slide, please. And this probably, in terms of people's perception, is most clearly seen with the draft riots of 1864. Probably the single largest riot in the history of New York. 3 days they had to actually call troops back from Gettysburg during the Civil War to put the rioters down and to restore order in the city. Really something that makes recent events in Los Angeles totally pale by comparison. Hundreds of people potentially dying, large parts of the city destroyed. And of course, that center, the initial center of this, is the Five Points area in that lower Manhattan, which had become already seen as sort of the quintessential immigrant slum. And you see this in mass media. Interestingly, this is, of course, the very moment that mass media is really starting up. We're really beginning to see the origins of a popular press, of basically tabloid journalism. And soon after this, of course, photography, which brings these images of what slum life looked like to a middle-class audience in New York, but also outside of New York. And you really get a sense of people having an almost voyeuristic interest in and also horror by what's going on in areas that of the city that may only be a short trolley ride from where they actually are. Okay, next slide, please. What's interesting, of course, is that the notion that the Irish and the Germans pose some sort of fundamental existential threat to peace and tranquility of New York City dissipates very fast. In the 1860s, of course, there is this massive riot. By the 1880s, the mayor of New York is of Irish origin, as is a very large part of a fast-growing police force. So in some ways, the crisis rhetoric passed in large part because the city managed to absorb the goods. But also, I think, because by the end of the 19th century, people who looked considerably more exotic are showing up. So in some ways, the Germans and the Irish seem not nearly as strange to New Yorkers when they start to get large influxes of a much more diverse migration that happens in the 1880s, starting really in the 1880s, and up until 1923. Now, the largest two groups are Eastern European Jews. There had been a small Jewish population of German origin that had actually come with the other German migrants after the political uprisings in Germany in 1848. But the real mass presence of Jews, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, there was this Portuguese origin Jewish population that had been present in the city since colonial times. But both of those are dwarfed by the Jewish population that starts to settle in the city, starting really in the 1880s and continues right up through the 1920s. Most are poor, poorer than earlier Jewish migrants, but they become very rapidly upwardly mobile. There's a very strong ethno-religious identity within the group, which links these poor newcomers with more previously established immigrants who established many organizations to try to uplift their fellow congregates. One of the other reasons, I think, for the rapid upward mobility of Jewish migrants in the city is that, unlike almost any other migrant group, they send very little money home. Okay? Remittances, as we call them in the social sciences. That is this idea that people will send money back home to support life in the previous country and may eventually retire to that country, is much, much lower among this group. Because after all, the previous countries they were coming from were not countries that they thought of as their own anyway. And there was very little interest on the part of Eastern European Jews in investing back in the countries from which they came. So to the extent that any money came out of the US and particularly out of New York back to Russia or Poland or Austria-Hungary, it was largely going to steamship tickets to bring other people across. Now, that's much less true of the other largest group of that period, which is Southern Italians, who are largely fleeing the intense poverty of Southern Italy and Sicily in the late 19th century. And that group remains far more working class. It does send a lot of remittances home, but it also has a significant middle class minority, even about immigration, and it does eventually achieve fairly considerable upper mobility. What's interesting, of course, during this period is that these, while the largest two groups, are only the largest of dozens of groups of immigrants that are coming in. Next slide, please. And there are many, many smaller groups established enclaves in the city. There you can see a picture of Chinatown from the 1920s. That's only one of many groups that during what we think of as the Ellis Island years are coming into New York. And next slide, please. I love these pictures because there was a employee at Ellis Island, one of the managers there, had this, was kind of a very, had this interest in photography, back when photography was still a relatively new hobby. And one of the things that he did was to take many, many pictures of people arriving in Ellis Island in their indigenous dress. Now, it may well have been that that wasn't what they normally wore. He probably asked them, you know, what do you have in your luggage that really looks particularly traditional or ethnic, and had them put it on. And this is kind of part of the Hunkayer assimilationist ethos of the place. Here, these people from all these exotic locales are going to turn into Americans and look like other Americans very soon. But because of this, we have this really amazing collection of photographs of people who had arrived. And if you get a chance to go to the Ellis Island Museum, it's really quite stunning. He was quite a talented photographer, but also the variety of different people, different modes of dress, different attitudes. And of course, our sympathy with these folks who, having just arrived from a very long steamship voyage, found themselves being involuntarily subjects of his photography. But in any event, it really is a quite remarkable collection. Back to the question of crisis. Once again, there was a perception that the problem was massive numbers. Over 1 million people came to Ellis Island in 1907, which was the peak year of that migration. And I think this is one of those moments at which New York suddenly, and big cities in general, are very split from the rest of the country in terms of perception. In 1920, Warren Harding ran for president with the slogan that we needed to return to normalcy. Now, I think the actual word should have been normality and not normalcy, but the word normalcy enters the vocabulary of Americans at that point. What does he mean by normalcy? Well, obviously, one thing he means is no foreign engagements in war. We just come out of World War I, and there was the idea that we were going to go back to a world in which the United States was sheltered by its great oceans and was going to be really apart from the wars in Europe or Asia, that we're no longer going to be the world's policeman. And this is the notion, of course, that returns often in the 20th century. The other thing, however, was the idea that the country was becoming too diverse, too abnormal, that there was a need to return to true Americanness, whatever that meant. What it usually meant was Protestantism. So in 1921, there's an immigration bill passed that hugely cuts down the number of immigrants. But not only does it cut it down, it also sets quotas on immigration based on country of origin. So it really favors Northern Europe. Now, ironically, among the places it favors are Germany and Ireland. Um, but also Britain, the Scandinavian countries, Protestant countries in Northern Europe are really the main beneficiaries. Now, by 1921, there weren't that many people from those countries who wanted to come. So those quotas often go unfilled. At the same time, large numbers of people who want to come to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe, as well as from Asia, from the Caribbean, are largely excluded from the possibility of immigration. However, the 1921 law doesn't last for long because all people already think that the 21 law is too generous, and they reset the quotas in 1924, but this time based not on the census of 1920, the most recent one, or 1910 or 1900, based on the census of 1890, with the idea that we want to go back to 1890 levels of ethnic diversity, you know. And by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, Asians had already been completely excluded since 1882. Okay, so you have excluded Asians. There's very little immigration from Africa, though there is some. And Southern and Eastern Europe is now added to the people who are ethnically and racially excluded from the United States by virtue of the fact that the numbers have been very small in 1890 and the quotas are stuck on 1890 levels. One of the interesting footnotes to this, by the way, is that this was not an uncontroversial bill at the time. And the main opponent in the US Congress was a freshman congressman from Brooklyn by the name of Emanuel Seller. If I were teaching in class, I'd be writing that name on the board right now. Keep that one in mind because it becomes important later. Manny Seller in 1924 delivers his first major address to Congress, opposing, he represents Flatbush, and he is opposing the imposition of quotas and really defending immigration as an important part of New York, but also America's economic, cultural, and intellectual unit. And this becomes a theme, I think, a lot of New Yorkers rally around. Well, he loses 1924, but the Democrats end up nominating a child of immigrants and a Catholic for president in 1928, Al Smith, the governor of New York. He gets slaughtered in one of the more lopsided elections of the 20th century, with a great deal of resistance from people throughout the country to the idea of a Catholic president, and specifically the idea of a New York president. Nevertheless, he carries the 10 largest cities. The notion that something rather different is happening in the cities in terms of his attitude to migration. And Smith, of course, is really become symbolic of a more generous attitude towards migration, but also, interestingly, for opposition to prohibition, which had also come in during that same return to normalcy period. Now, can I have the next slide, please? So, this is a quote from, I got a little ahead of myself here, but this is a quote from Glaser and Moynihan's Beyond the Melting Pot, which was written in the early 1960s, in which they talk about how New York had a different attitude towards racial diversity, in part because no group was dominant. And I think this is something that becomes increasingly clear later on as more immigrant groups arrive. That even during this period where immigration is actually quite low, you have this attitude where, as they put it, groups might not like each other. This is not to say that people had this wonderful appreciation. I mean, New Yorkers are filled with all kinds of prejudices against specific groups, but immigration itself wasn't seen as generally an okay thing, or certainly not unexpected or outrageous, as they put it. This is not necessarily a reservoir of goodwill for groups different from one's own, but the evolving system of intergroup relations, which permits accommodation, change, and the rise of new groups. And the next slide, please. And I think this becomes particularly clear in the mid-20th century, ironically, in part because new immigration was virtually at a standstill. In fact, if there's a discussion of a crisis, it really has to do with new migration from the American South and Puerto Rico. But it has to do really with the coming of age of the second generation, which is something that I've written about in more recent times. New York in the middle of the 20th century is really a second generation city. Okay? This is the cult. You see this in the culture, the music of George Gershwin and Copland, Frank Sinatra, Broadway, early television are all dominated by people who are the children, or in a few cases, the grandchildren of immigrants, not so much immigrants themselves. In politics, of the 8 men who served as mayor of New York between 1933 and 1989, one was an immigrant, O'Dwyer. Actually, 2 were immigrants, if you want to be technical about it, because they beam arrived in the city as an infant, but he was literally babe in arms. One was a longtime American, John Lindsay. All the rest were the children of immigrants, born here to immigrant parents. And that becomes almost the modal experience of New York. It's kind of everybody's parents are from somewhere, but we belong here. And I think in the mid-20th century, this really takes hold as a real part of the American ethos. That doesn't mean, of course, that we're done with the perception of crises. Next slide, please. In fact, in the 1970s, we're faced with the other urban crisis, the non-urban crisis, the non-immigrant crisis, rather, which kind of had been brewing for some time. Some of you may remember this quote from Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning, sportscasters looking out over the Bronx during the World Series, and they take a break from covering the Yankees to have, I guess it was a Goodyear blimp or something that had an aerial photograph, and you could actually see fires in the South Bronx. This notion of the city at the edge of collapse, becomes very, very ingrained in the 1970s. And the origins of it are earlier. Suburbanization, lots of particularly children of immigrants moving out to the New York suburbs and to some degree moving to the country beyond that. Robert Moses's highways leading the way out for people. Deindustrialization, the fact that strong back jobs that you didn't need English or you didn't need a lot of education to do are in decline. There are the racial conflicts of the 1960s, which were never as intense in New York as they were in a lot of other cities, but were very real, particularly with the growing Black and Latino population. There was a remarkable rise in crime during this period. And again, this idea of crime and associated disorder, which is not exactly the same thing as crime, but people often perceive the two as linked, was also having this effect in New York. And the 1970s are actually the only decade in New York's history in which the city actually lost population. And once again, this leads to some degree of conflict with the federal government. Next slide, please. Some of you must be old enough to remember this headline. I do. I may be the only one. New York enters a fiscal crisis in 1976 and needs a loan to bail it out. The reaction from the Ford administration is the one that was captured so articulately by the Daily News. Ford through city dropped dead as the president threatened to veto any bailout for the city. The result, of course, was not was sort of a bailout orchestrated by the banks and the state. It came at some very real costs. There were austerity measures, cost to city services, what was described as planned shrinkage by Roger Starr, the housing commissioner. This was the idea that New York, because it had expanded too much due to migration, had to become a smaller city, had to become a city that was downsized to the extent that it could accommodate, but basically his estimate was that we needed a New York of about 6 million people, down from a little over 7 at the time, and that too much of the infrastructure was locked into a much larger population. Places like the South Bronx, or Upper Manhattan for that matter, had good subway service and a network of hospitals and a network of schools, but that we had to encourage a loss of population. Perhaps people should move to places where there were more jobs. You also see this fear in popular culture. And it's funny, right now there's kind of a nostalgia for the popular culture of the 70s. You see people looking back on movies like The Warriors. Am I the only one who remembers The Warriors? Or Escape from New York, or The Out-of-Towners, a kind of a gentler satire. It's the notion of New York as completely dissolving into crime and chaos and out of control, you know, and an ethnically polyglot out of control, but still that ethnic polyglot diversity was in some sense related to its being totally out of control and therefore violent. And it is true that this was a time of very rapid increase in crime and violence, but also one that was associated with, probably unfairly associated with increased diversity. And you certainly see this. And one of the ironies, I guess, of the present moment is, as I say, there's this kind of nostalgia for movies like The Warriors, for the beginnings of graffiti culture, for the real early origins by the end of that decade for hip hop, all of which were sort of being produced at this very moment when people were also thinking the city as somehow a dying city. But what is interesting here is that, just from an academic point of view, is that both the left and the right seem to, and I apologize, I just realized this slide says neo-Marxist / neoconservative consensus. But both people from the left and neoconservatives are noting what they see as a city that was doomed to decline because its size, its infrastructure, its cultural, but also just its physical shape were set up for an industrial city that no longer existed. Okay? And that the future was going to be in newer, polynucleated cities that didn't have one big center, that were more spread out, that were more likely manufacturing was taking place. First of all, jobs were being lost in manufacturing. Well, to the extent that they would continue in suburban campuses that were designed to accommodate that manufacturing. The world of the old loft buildings of Lower Manhattan was gone, and that as a result, New York was perhaps less radically going to go the way of Detroit, doomed to decline. Next slide, please. Well, they were wrong. Conservatives and left-wing opponents, left-wing observers and conservatives were simultaneously wrong about this. After the 1980s, we see a number of very marked trends in exactly the opposite direction. First of all, after a decade of rather extreme population loss, the population of New York began to grow again. In fact, it had reached nearly 9 million people in the beginnings of the COVID crisis. It dropped during COVID again, but is now in the neighborhood of 8.5 million, which basically means that since 1970, we've pretty much added Philadelphia. I mean that's a lot of, 1.5 million people. That's a big increase. There was a big economic recovery, albeit one that coincided with the real cuts in city services, but still, probably due to the financialization of the economy, Wall Street becomes the driver of major economic resurgence. And of course, there's a huge increase in tourism. Crime declined sharply. After 1991, we see really remarkable decrease in crime, in particularly street crimes in the city. That has reversed a little since COVID, and during COVID, crime went back up a bit. But it's kind of important that people remember just how high crime was in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's really nowhere near those levels today. What I call this is the sort of the James Jacobs virtuous cycle. No one, I mean, just among social scientists like myself, there's a really, really strange debate over what created the decline in crime. Bottom line is we don't know. Okay? There's no one good cause that you can point to. But what we are going to do know is that once crime begins to decline, particularly street crime, it encourages behaviors like people spending time in the streets, like things being open later, people having more trust in the authorities, like people having more trust in each other, that in fact then reduces crime further, which then becomes a virtuous cycle, because as people see more people in the street and as people become more accustomed to neighborhoods getting quote unquote better and getting safer, they spend more time and they invest more in those neighborhoods, which we get to, and you understand that we have a cyclical increase. So whatever the initial causes of the decline in crime, and there's all sorts of theories, drug use patterns change, populations changing, aging structure, all kinds of stuff like that. Once crime starts to decline, it becomes just as you get a vicious cycle when crime increases, people start to become very defensive, don't spend time in the streets, and more likely to react badly, more likely to carry weapons, all things that increase crime. The opposite is also true. When people start to trust that crime is in decline, things start to feel better. And as a result, crime decline leads to more crime decline. Now, that's not a New York unique experience. Crime declines everywhere in the United States in the 1990s. But what's interesting is that it declined more in New York, and it declined for a longer period of time. That even after the levels of crime more or less stabilized in most other big cities, in New York, they continued to go down right up until COVID. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that New Yorkers, we spend more time in the streets. We spend more time in public places. Okay, we're less likely to be in our automobiles all the time. So as a result, the impact of crime, both negative and positive, is felt much more intensely. There was a decline in public services and unionization compared to the 1970s, but those remain a lot higher. Both public service levels and also unionization remains an awful lot higher than it is in other U.S. cities. And of course, the city university, my employer and therefore my dear exploiter, institutes tuition for the first time, but it's still quite inexpensive. And if you, well, it doesn't seem inexpensive if you're paying the bills, I know, but it's relative to other colleges of the equivalent level, it remains quite inexpensive. And these two pictures come from our public relations / propaganda office, and they really kind of show the ethos of the place. Diverse students of every kind of background whose parents come from everywhere, coming together on the City College campus in that moment of upward mobility in the United States. And it's a nice story. It's a happy story. It is not always a completely true story, but it's as true as truer than not. So in that sense, it works. Next slide, please. I think, however, and I realize the last couple of minutes here have been something of a digression, but I think one of the more interesting things that is often missed in the discussion of New York's economic and social recovery is the resumption of mass migration. In 1965, the quota system is eliminated, and we reopen the country for mass migration into the United States. And remember Manny Seller, I mentioned earlier? Emmanuel Seller, 41 years after his initial opposition and his attempts to block the the immigration quotas in 1924. 41 years later, he's the head of the House Judiciary Committee and the primary author of the Hart-Celler Immigration Reform Bill, which essentially opens up the doors for new immigration to the United States. It doesn't really affect Latin America, interestingly, even though it's sometimes associated with that, but it eliminates the exclusion of Asians completely, although that had already begun in the 1940s, and it eliminates the quotas for Europeans and Africans. Suddenly, the doors in that sense are open. And in New York, this move is popular, as Seller's big support for it would indicate. New York is thought of very often now as a sanctuary city, even under Republican administrations. We forget that the executive order for our law enforcement not to cooperate with the immigration authorities was issued by every mayor since Dinkins, including Giuliani, who probably regrets it at this point, but at the time, this was seen as the only logical thing to do. By 1921, the public schools were dedicated to communicating with parents in 151 languages other than English. They don't always do that great a job of it, but at least in theory, on the website, they list languages in which 151 different languages in which people should be allowed to communicate with their school officials. And of the English language learners, of course, 61% are Spanish speakers, something I hardly need tell residents of Upper Manhattan. But Spanish speakers, while they're still the majority of non-English speaking students, they're hardly the only group. Large numbers speak Chinese, Arabic, Bengali, Russian, Urdu, Haitian Creole, Uzbek, French, and Tajik at this point in the city system. And I think this is accompanied by a kind of, for lack of a better word, positive view on the part of a lot of the city bureaucracy. So I put up this picture here of New York as the city of immigrants that was pointed out in a brochure that the Board of Education put out to make people aware of the various services for immigrants they offer. Next slide, please. There was supposed to be a pie chart in this slide, and somehow it hasn't come through. Well, were there a pie chart there, you would see that New York's immigration and New York's ethnic population now, the immigrants of New York are an extremely diverse group in which no particular group dominates. And this gets to an issue that, let me change my theme. An issue that is, well, the description for this phenomenon, although it wasn't originally done for New York, I'm borrowing from the anthropologist Stephen Verdebeck, who works in Germany, but who is discussing what he calls superdiversity. What happens when it's not only that there are new groups in a society, but that new groups are extremely numerous and no one group is able to dominate. And I think that what's important about that in New York is that, well, for example, as again, apropos of being speaking to an Upper Manhattan audience, as you're all well aware, the largest single group of foreign-born people in New York at the moment are Dominicans. But Dominicans account for only less than 14% of all the immigrants. No one group is dominant, which means in some ways that you don't get the kind of hard edges of conflict, that people are in worlds of shifting alliances, of shifting connections. If you're in a neighborhood like Washington Heights or Inwood or Flushing or Sunset Park in Brooklyn, there may be a particular group that the neighborhood is associated with, but there's lots of people from different places. And as a result, people start to make contact with different kinds of folks who bring politics and service delivery. The fact is that integration doesn't track onto race the way it does in many U.S. cities. Next slide, please. So it also has become a very racially diverse city and almost equally divided, as you can see, between whites, Hispanics, blacks, and that pink thing. And I don't know why this didn't come through when we sent in these slides, but that pink thing in the corner is Asians, which is the most rapidly growing group at the moment. Um, and you see that there's substantial numbers of all of these now. So rather than get kind of a conflict-ridden division between two large groups or three large groups, one dominant, the other is not, you get diversity across the board and diversity that doesn't end up mapping, as I say, onto racial division. Now, this happy story now takes on, in the last couple of years, what may be a somewhat negative valence in what we might call the newest immigrant crisis. We're back to another crisis. Next slide, please. And I think this new crisis really begins with the asylum seeker. As we all know, a huge number of people are coming across the southern border seeking asylum. Now, this is a real transition. For a long time, undocumented immigration, illegal immigration, for lack of a better, was dominated by people who were trying not to interact with the immigration authorities. Right? When people crossed the border, they tended to run away from the immigrant authorities. In the early 2000s, the change occurs. People are running towards the immigration authority. They're running towards because they want to be able to request asylum. People from fulfilling desperate situations in Venezuela, Central America, Haiti, China, Ukraine, and West Africa, among other places, are looking to request asylum in the United States. And very often, they're the ones coming across the border and immediately putting in an asylum request. Now, international law being what it is, you have to give people the right to request asylum. You don't have to grant it, but you have to review their case and give it to them. And there's real good reasons for that. You know, an awful lot of countries view that, including the United States, view that their reactions to fascism in the 1930s and 40s were definitely had very bad results when they weren't letting people in. Remember those strict quota systems. And after the war, there was a rethinking of that and a rethinking of what people owe, what all countries owe people who are in desperate straits and who have fear of persecution or fear for their lives, and what our humane obligations to them are. But in any event, there become a large number of people entering the United States, and a very large number of them want to come to New York, possibly because that's where they know people, because they're a community established, possibly because they know it as a place of opportunity, but in many cases, because the governors of states in the South were closer to the border, were actually giving them bus tickets or putting them on buses themselves and sending them into the city. So starting in early 2022, we ended up receiving about 200,000 newcomers arriving in the city, mostly, you know, from southern states, mostly being dumped out of buses into Midtown, being processed by the good folks from the Hellerfund Hospitals Corporation and the Roosevelt Hotel, you know, in the 40s, and then looking for a way to survive in the city. Now, most are not legally allowed to work. Eventually, there were some attempt to create work permits for some of these folks, but they are legally present in the country. They're not undocumented. In fact, they have lots of documents, but they're not legally allowed to work. However, in New York, under the right to shelter rulings, the Callahan consent decree, the city is obligated to provide some form of shelters for them. And that creates a really new set of demands on the city, which in some ways are, if not unprecedented, at least a very distinct challenge. Next slide, please. And we get a political reaction. You all remember this. Actually, so much has happened in the past year, you may not remember this, but If you remember in 2023, Mayor Adams was talking about how the city was being destroyed by this influx. It was totally unprecedented. Well, not so unprecedented, but nevertheless. Um, it does, however, show a distinct problem with migration that I think has longstanding in this country, and that is that immigration policy is set by the federal government, but the costs are borne locally. Um, it is the cities usually or localities that end up with the expense of housing people, certainly the expense of educating people, with the expenses involved in criminal justice, with the expenses involved in healthcare. All of these tend to be locally borne. On the other hand, the question of how much asylum to be granted, how many asylum judges there were going to be, how many people should be permitted to immigrate legally, all of that's decided at the federal level. So there really is a kind of a disconnect, almost structurally. And of course, the Trump administration has made this even more pronounced. Um, and we've certainly seen in the last really just month or so, this upsurge of raids and the Trump administration essentially targeting undocumented people, often people who may even have orders of deportation, but traditionally would not have been deported in quite the ways they are. People, even as we just saw with Van Lander the other day, who are going in to check in on their legal status or who have been requested for an interview with the ICE office and then suddenly being arrested. I would also suggest that the perception that this has led to a crisis also bears, although it's not really related to immigration, a kind of a leftover sense of anxiety from COVID-19. Which is to say, I think that we kind of got, in some ways in 2022, a perfect storm of issues that had evolved through the pandemic, issues involved in changes in bail policy. I suppose the legalization of cannabis had something to do with this, with all of these stores suddenly selling cannabis in an uncontrolled way, and lots of new migrants, mostly housed in places that were very, very visible. This has already started to change as more and more people have ended up in the immigrant neighborhoods in the outer boroughs. But in the initial reaction to these bus lifts, as they're called, people were being housed in midtown hotels. And that makes people very, very aware of their presence because they're in a place that is very, very public. Next step. Next slide, please. And as a result, I think you got a kind of, as you often do in an immigration crisis, a mixed message. Again, New York was dealing with a right to shelter legal situation that comes from the Callahan consent decree. Conservatives, once again, were blaming municipal profligacy, as they did in the fiscal crisis. The idea that the city is just too generous. That's the problem. The city administration ended up kind of speaking out of both sides of its mouth, right? On the one hand, immigrants are what create New York. Immigrants make New York great. We love immigrants, but please don't come. We're full. And it's ironic, but not surprising, that many of those who were protesting the new influx of immigrants were themselves immigrants. I say not surprising because if you think about it, the people who are most competing with this week's immigrants in terms of access to services, in terms of access to jobs, in terms of access to housing, are probably last week's immigrants. People who are directly in competition, not so much the native workforce. And you certainly saw this in a lot of the protests about the conversion of, say, schools to housing, to do emergency housing, or other facilities to be given emergency housing, very often in immigrant neighborhoods. Next slide, please. I think the moment that really crystallized this for me was when Mayor Adams visited Puebla in Mexico during his tour of Latin America. The ostensible purpose of the tour was to spread the message that New York is full, please don't come, right? And he was traveled to mostly Central America, but he had to stop off in Mexico, which is not really a big contributor to the new immigrants, and go to the city of Puebla, which is 700 miles from the border and has absolutely nothing to do with the current influx, but is the capital of the region of Mexico that the large majority of Mexican migrants in New York come from. And of course, who does he go with? He goes with leaders of the Mexican community, poblanos themselves, businessmen, politicians who are going to make that trip to Puebla part of the New York itinerary. I should mention that New York mayors always have certain foreign policy obligations, as many of you know. They used to say how they almost always had to visit Dublin at some point. These days, they're more likely to visit Rome and Tel Aviv. Increasingly, they visit San Juan. But now, for the first time, they're visiting, and San Domingo, come to think of it. But now, for the first time, they're going to Puebla. And with Mayor Adams went a number of these Poblano leaders. This is a real mixed message because here he's trying to discourage new migration, which he says is destroying the city. But at the same time, he's making speeches to community leaders from Puebla who have connections with the leadership of Puebla about how migration to Puebla had been a huge advantage to both New York and to the city of Puebla. Well, so what does this mean about how New Yorkers think of migration? And let me just devote a few minutes now to question of a new study that is so hot off the presses, we don't even have a lot of pretty graphics for you, but something that I've been doing with some collaborators at CUNY. Next slide, please. With my collaborator, Liza Steele, and a bunch of very talented graduate students, I fielded last October a study of 1,250 New Yorkers about what their attitudes about immigration were. And what was surprising, given the fact that this was the absolute peak of mayoral hyperbole about the negative impacts of migration, the new migration, it remained relatively positive. About 70% thought that immigration made the country a better place to live in. 64% believed that immigrants created more jobs than they took, than they occupied, and only about 10% felt that immigrants took more out of the country than they contribute to. Next slide, please. Only about 30% supported, opposed rather, the city providing emergency housing to new arrivals. And that's, I think, notable given how terrible the housing situation is and the fact that the city faces a perennial housing shortage. 20% or fewer New Yorkers oppose asylum seekers receiving health care from the city or sending their kids to the public school. That seems to be something that's almost universal in New York. About 80% actually favored granting work permits. The biggest problem a lot of people had with the new migration is that people weren't being given the right to work while their cases were being adjudicated. And interestingly, whether people have pro or anti-immigrant attitudes seems almost completely unrelated to whether the respondent is an immigrant themselves. This is one of those areas in which the immigrants and their children look exactly like natives and their children. Next slide, please. There are real concerns, however, in terms of our pro-immigrant attitudes. Now, it's possible that this reflects a less pro-immigrant attitude than it would have been had we done the study 5 years earlier. We don't know because we didn't do it. But it still maintains, you know, compared to the rest of the country, quite positive attitudes. Interestingly, the most positive attitudes were about culture. When we ask all kinds of questions about, you know, has immigration improved the city's life in terms of cuisine, in terms of music, in terms of art, in terms of all kinds of cultural expression, it's almost universally positive. There was a more mixed but generally positive feeling about the effects on the economy. There were quite negative feelings about immigration, and the biggest concern with crime. You know, when you ask people about the specifics, it turned out once again, what they meant by crime was often public disorder. And again, I'm not really sure that's a migrant issue, but it is perceived that way because the influx of new asylum seekers really came about the same time as a lot of very real problems in terms of disorder in the public streets, and the sense that things were becoming dirty, that things were breaking down, that was connected to real risks of crime, even though in actuality, at least according to the official statistics, crime was declining during those years after having reached a semi-peak during COVID. So I realize I've talked a long time now, so let me get to the final takeaways. I think, once again, as in the past, migration presents New York with a lot of problems, or rather, it causes problems that could be managed. I think it is not an existential crisis, and wasn't, and most New Yorkers do not perceive it as such. There are not huge differences based on where the asylum seekers come from. What was really interesting to us is that the most popular groups, when we asked, who should be allowed, were Ukrainians, which is not a big surprise, but also Haitians, which kind of counters a lot of your questions about, racial diversity. What will this mean if the ICE raids continue? I don't know. It is certainly true that the Trump administration policies of conducting raids has taken a lot of people who are not the intended targets into the dragnet grabs an awful lot of people. And, unlike the large number of deportations during the Obama administration, where they were mostly people who were coming out of the criminal justice system, mostly criminal deportations, at this point, there seems to be a wide and a kind of almost lack of logic to who's subject to deportation. What that will mean in terms of people's everyday perceptions, I don't know. It does seem to me it means it's very likely to be people in trouble who are folks that many New Yorkers see as their neighbors and friends, and that may in fact change attitudes. Anyway, thank you very much. Sorry to go long, and I thank you for your attention. Final slide, please. And I'd love to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions, and I think we can spare a few minutes for these questions, if that's all right with you. Oh, this is more of a statement than a question, but let me see if I can turn it into a question. We had somebody commented that environmental health professionals speculate that lead paint had a relationship to crime rather than migration. Is this something you know about?
Yeah, when I was listing the various, that's one that I should have mentioned. When I was listing the various questions about why crime went up in the 70s, why it went down later, one of them actually is the lead paint issue. Don't think, to me, the evidence on that hasn't seemed completely convincing, but it may very well have been a contributing factor at various points. It is certainly true that the health effects of lead paint are real, and that there were probably some positive effects with the reduction of the amount of lead paint used. Although in New York, since there wasn't that much, how much, what I don't know is whether there was significant lead abatement during the periods when crime went down, to explain very much. They were certainly not using new lead paint, but whether they were removing it or not, I don't know. And lead paint is most dangerous when it's actually flaking apart. So it's the old stuff you got to worry about. So I don't know, but it's certainly a possibility. As I say, we really don't have a really good grasp on why crime goes up at some moments or down in others. But what we do know is that when people are afraid of crime because it's going up, they do things to make it worse. And when people become less afraid of crime because it's going down, they do things to make it better. So it often is a cyclical kind of arrangement.
Okay. Another question we had, I know you talked about the decrease in immigration in the 70s, but somebody was asking whether New York City was also considered a sanctuary city, even in the increase in street crime during the 80s and 90s.
It was.
Yeah.
And law enforcement actually were among the advocates of the sanctuary city policies. Because what people forget is that it becomes very difficult for law enforcement to do its job if people won't report crime or if people are afraid to be witnesses. So in many ways, law enforcement and people, particularly in the attorney's offices, but also among the police, have usually been advocates of not cooperating with the immigration authorities, if only because when people are confident that they won't immediately be questioned about their immigration status, they're more likely to stay in touch with local police and DAs. They're more likely to give them information. They're more likely to be cooperative, and that's been true at least since the Dinkins administration as a formal policy. I believe actually the third Koch term actually approved it. But it's as a practical matter been true well since the 70s. Although I don't think there was an official policy with that. The other thing, of course, is that sanctuary cities also means that people are more likely to get vaccinated. They're more likely to, use public health care facilities. They're more likely to send their kids to public schools. And all of those things are good because diseases don't just affect one group of people, they affect everybody. So if people are paying attention to public health, warnings and things like that, or getting vaccinated, that's a good thing for a lot of people. So
Right.
in general, the sense that, and I don't think it's because of any massively pro-immigrant sentiment, as so much as sort of a general sense on the part of a lot of city bureaucrats that, look, the federal government should take care of the federal question of how many immigrants should be admitted to the country and how many asylum seekers, and the state and the local government should take care of the local questions. Like, let's maintain order in the streets, get people vaccinated, and get kids educated. And if those missions contradict each other, we can't mix them up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. Getting to see your results a little bit hot off the presses was very interesting, so timely right now.
Mhm.
So thank you so much again, Dr. Kasinitz, for being here and for delivering this information for us.
Well, thank you. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to your audience and watch this space because more from this study will be coming out in the next couple of months. This is actually, I think, the first time actually I've spoken about some of the top line stats, and we literally don't have the charts and graphs yet and all the controls put in yet, but we will within 2 or 3 months. So there's going
Great.
to be news on this.
We'll have to do a check-in with you.
Please
That'll be
do.
great. Wonderful. Well, I hope that everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. Stay tuned for more details about other programs and events happening at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum by visiting our website or following us on social media. You can find those links in the chat. And thank you so much for attending, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.